If you are new here, make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. Every story we tell is rooted in history. And history, as you are about to discover, can be far more terrifying than fiction. We begin tonight in rural Ontario, in a small farming township where Irish immigrants built their lives from nothing, and where their neighbors decided those lives were not worth protecting. The Roman line was not an official name on any government map. It was what the locals called a stretch of concession road in Biddulph Township, Upper Canada, roughly 25 kilometers northwest of London, Ontario. The name came from the people who settled it, Irish Catholic immigrants who had arrived in waves throughout the 1840s, many of them broken and desperate, fleeing the catastrophic Great Famine that had already claimed over 1 million lives back in Ireland between 1845 and 1852. They came to Canada with almost nothing. They built farms from frozen ground, raised families in wooden homes, and tried to rebuild a sense of community in a land that did not entirely welcome them. Biddulph Township was predominantly Protestant. The Irish Catholics of the Roman line were a minority, and in the mid-19th century, that distinction mattered enormously. It was into this world that the Donnelly family arrived. James Donnelly Sr. and his wife Johanna had settled on the Roman line in the 1840s with their children. Over the years, the family grew. 7 sons, a daughter, a farmhouse, a name, and slowly, inevitably, a reputation. The Donnellys were not quiet people. In a community built on unspoken rules, inherited grievances, and a deep cultural code of silence, the Donnellys broke every expectation placed on them. They argued openly. They formed friendships with Protestant neighbors at a time when doing so was considered an act of social betrayal. When Father John Connolly, the local Catholic priest, began preaching anti-Protestant sermons from the pulpit of St. Patrick's Roman Catholic Church, it was James Donnelly himself who stood up in the middle of the congregation and publicly denounced the priest. He announced that from that point forward, his family would attend a Catholic parish in London instead. The room would have gone very quiet, and it only got worse. When the local Anglican Church, a Protestant institution, needed funding for its establishment, James Donnelly donated money toward it. To many on the Roman line, this was not just unusual, it was unforgivable. In living memory, the Catholic Church had been violently persecuted in Ireland, and here was one of their own, handing money to the other side. The Donnellys, for their part, made no apologies. They had Protestant friends who later attended their funeral. They did not hide that fact, but the family was not without fault. Altercations with the law were not uncommon. Johanna, the family matriarch, was noted for her particularly fierce confrontations with local constables. The men of the family had their own long history of disputes, violence, and community conflict. The Donnellys were stubborn, loud, and utterly unwilling to be told who they should be. In a township already wound tight with old-world tension, that stubbornness made them enemies. Not just rivals, enemies. By June of 1879, the situation in Biddulph had reached a boiling point. Father Connolly, determined to restore what he called order to the community, established the Biddulph Peace Society. He asked every member of his congregation to formally pledge their support. The agreement included allowing homes to be searched for stolen property, a provision clearly aimed at the Donnellys, whom many suspected of theft and property destruction. Every family on the Roman line signed the pledge. The Donnellys refused. That refusal was seen as a declaration, and within months, a militant splinter group broke away from the Peace Society entirely. They began holding covert meetings at the Cedar Swamp Schoolhouse in Biddulph, away from the main congregation, away from daylight. The group included local men with long personal grievances against the Donnelly family, men who had been waiting for permission to act. Among them was Constable James Carroll, a law enforcement officer who had his own personal history with the family. This group became known as the Vigilance Committee, and through the second half of 1879, evidence later suggested they were responsible for a series of arsons, property damage, and acts of physical intimidation carried out across Biddulph. The Peace Society, the organization built in the name of community harmony, had quietly become something else entirely, something that was building toward a single. The night of February 4th, 1880, was bitterly cold. In the early hours of the morning, a mob of men, estimates suggest at least 30 individuals, gathered and moved through the darkness toward the Donnelly homestead. They carried weapons, they had a plan, and they had been waiting for this moment for a long time. What happened inside that farmhouse in the hours before dawn is almost too brutal to recount in full detail. The mob entered the home. James Donnelly Sr. was killed. Johanna, the fierce matriarch who had spent decades refusing to be silenced, was killed. Two of their sons, Thomas and John, were killed inside the house. Their niece, Bridget, who had traveled from Ireland just months earlier to live with the family, was also killed. She was 22 years old. The farmhouse was then set on fire. 5 members of the Donnelly family burned in that house or died in the violence that surrounded it. But the night was not finished. The mob then moved toward the home of Will Donnelly, who lived nearby. Will was asleep when the attack began. His brother John, a different John, a cousin of the family, had come to stay that night. When Jim Ryder approached the side door carrying a shotgun and called out Will's name, it was John who opened the door. He was met with a hail of gunshots directly to the chest and groin. 30 separate wounds were later counted on his body. They pierced his lung, shattered his collarbone, and broke several ribs. John collapsed to the ground. McLaughlin and Ryder walked up to where he lay and fired 7 more shots into his body. Inside the house, Will Donnelly pressed himself against the wall of his bedroom and peered through a narrow gap in the window. In the darkness outside, he could make out faces he recognized: James Carroll, John Kennedy, Big Mike Heenan, William Carroll, Patrick Ryder. They were only feet away from where he was hiding. He could hear them. His wife Nora had rushed outside when she heard the commotion. She found John on the ground, bleeding, and tried to drag him to safety. He was too heavy for her to move alone. A man named Hogan crawled out on his hands and knees and helped pull John's body inside. The bloody trail he left behind stretched across the doorway. John Donnelly died 5 minutes later. The men outside were exhausted. They had already carried out the massacre at the main farmhouse. They circled the perimeter of Will's home for nearly 3 hours. The people inside did not move, did not make a sound. Then, finally, a voice broke the silence. "There's been enough bloodshed tonight, boys. Let's go home." Those words, spoken by a man named Jim Feehily, ended the massacre. The mob dispersed into the darkness. The frozen fields of Biddulph Township went quiet. In the days that followed, the story spread quickly. 6 people were dead. A farmhouse had been reduced to ash and bone. Witnesses had seen the faces of the men responsible. 2 separate trials were held. The evidence was substantial. There was even a reliable eyewitness, a young boy named Johnny O'Connor, who had been sleeping at the Donnelly home that night, had hidden under a bed, and had watched the mob carry out the killings with his own eyes. It did not matter. No one was ever convicted. The community closed ranks. The code of silence that the Donnellys had spent decades refusing to honor was now being used to protect the very people who had killed them. Witnesses recanted, juries deliberated, and returned nothing. The men who had gathered at the Cedar Swamp schoolhouse, who had marched through the snow that February night, who had fired 30 rounds into a man standing in his own doorway, they went home. They went back to their farms. They lived out the rest of their lives in Biddulph Township. James Carroll, the constable who had stood just feet from Will Donnelly's bedroom window, was never convicted. The graves of the Donnelly family still exist in St. Patrick's Cemetery on the Roman line. People visit them to this day, and if you stand there long enough, looking out at the flat Ontario farmland that stretches in every direction, it is difficult not to think about what it means when an entire community decides that some lives simply do not matter, that no one will be punished, that no one will even speak. The Donnelly Massacre is one of the most well-documented cases of vigilante violence in Canadian history, and yet, to this day, not a single person was ever held accountable. But the Donnellys are not the only family whose story was buried in the silence of a small Canadian town. The Highway of Tears. Highway 16 is one of the longest stretches of road in British Columbia. It runs 719 kilometers through the northern interior of the province, connecting the city of Prince George in the east to the coastal city of Prince Rupert in the west. For most of its length, it cuts through some of the most remote and isolated wilderness in Canada, dense forest pressing in from both sides, mountain ranges visible in the distance, vast stretches of road where no town, no gas station, no sign of human presence appears for dozens of kilometers at a time. It is, by any measure, a beautiful highway. It is also one of the most dangerous stretches of road in the country. Not because of the terrain, not because of the weather, though northern British Columbia winters are punishing. It is dangerous because of what has been happening along its length for over 50 years. Since 1969, the year the highway was completed, women have been vanishing from it. Not one woman, not two, dozens. And the vast majority of them were Indigenous. The communities that sit along Highway 16 are small and spread far apart. Towns like Vanderhoof, Burns Lake, Houston, Smithers, Terrace. Between them, the distances are enormous. A trip to see a family member, to reach a medical appointment, to get to school or find work. These are not short drives. They are journeys of hours. And in communities where poverty rates are high and vehicle ownership is low, those journeys have historically been made the only way many people could afford to make them, by standing on the side of the road and waiting for someone to stop. Hitchhiking along Highway 16 was not unusual. For many residents of the communities along the corridor, it was simply a fact of life, a necessity. Public transportation between towns was largely non-existent for many years. If you needed to get somewhere, you waited, you put out your thumb, you trusted that the person who stopped had good intentions. For decades, that trust was exploited by someone, or multiple someones, who did not. The first victim disappeared in 1969. The cases that followed came in a pattern that investigators and community members would come to know with grim familiarity. A young woman, often Indigenous, often traveling between communities, a roadside, a last confirmed sighting, and then nothing. In many cases, the bodies were never found. The terrain along Highway 16 works against investigators in ways that are almost difficult to comprehend. The region is vast and heavily forested. The soil in many areas is soft enough to make burial disturbingly easy, and the wilderness that borders the highway is home to carnivorous scavengers that regularly carry away human remains before search teams can locate them. Evidence disappears, not just because of time, but because the land itself consumes it. Before December 2024, much of the highway had no cellular telephone service at all. A woman in distress on a remote stretch of Highway 16 had no way to call for help, no way to contact anyone. She was entirely alone with whoever was in that car. The name came from grief. In 1998, a vigil was held in Terrace, British Columbia, for the women who had gone missing and been murdered along the highway. A woman named Florence Nazil, thinking about the families of the victims, the mothers, the sisters, the daughters left behind, gave the corridor its name, the Highway of Tears. She was thinking about the crying, the years of crying that the families had done and continued to do, the grief that had settled into these communities and simply never left. The name stayed, because the disappearances did not stop. The official numbers and the real numbers do not agree with each other. The RCMP's Project E-PANA, a dedicated investigative unit created specifically to examine the cases along Highway 16, places the confirmed number of victims at fewer than 18. That is the official count, fewer than 18 women. Indigenous organizations working directly with the affected communities put the number above 40. That gap, between fewer than 18 and more than 40, represents women whose disappearances were never fully investigated, cases that were closed too quickly or never properly opened, women who were reported missing and whose files gathered dust in police stations while their families continued searching. The disproportionate number of Indigenous women among the victims is not a coincidence. It is the product of systems that had been failing these communities for generations. The Canadian Indian residential school system had separated families, severed cultural connections, and left entire generations without the support structures that most Canadians took for granted. The foster care system had further fractured family units. Poverty was widespread. Drug abuse, in communities already dealing with generational trauma, was common. Domestic violence rates were high. These were not random vulnerabilities. They were the accumulated weight of deliberate historical policies, and they created conditions in which young indigenous women could disappear from a public highway year after year, and the response from authorities could remain, for decades, deeply, shamefully inadequate. The families knew what was happening long before it became a national conversation. Mothers who had reported their daughters missing and been told to wait. Sisters who had driven the highway themselves, stopping at every rest stop and gas station, showing photographs to strangers. Grandmothers who had buried their grief in silence because no one in a position of authority seemed willing to listen. For years, the pattern was ignored. The victims were indigenous, often poor, often already marginalized by a system that had never fully recognized their worth. Their disappearances were treated as the inevitable consequence of the choices they had made. Hitchhiking, being out at night, trusting strangers, as if any of that justified what was done to them, as if any of that explained why no one was being caught. Despite decades of investigation, the Highway of Tears cases remain among the most troubling unsolved crime clusters in Canadian history. Some victims have been identified. A small number of cases have been resolved. Robert Pickton, the British Columbia serial killer convicted in 2007, is believed to be responsible for some of the deaths, though his crimes centered on Vancouver's downtown east side. A man named Bobby Jack Fowler, an American drifter who died in an Oregon prison in 2006, was identified through DNA evidence in 2019 as the killer of at least one Highway 16 victim. But for most of the women on the list, the official list and the longer unofficial list, there are no answers. There are families still waiting. There are files still open. There are stretches of that highway where, if you slow your car and look at the tree line long enough, you understand in a very quiet and very certain way that the forest is keeping secrets it will never give back. Florence Nazil named the highway after the tears of the families who were left behind. Those families are still crying, and the highway is still there, still running 719 kilometers through the northern wilderness of British Columbia, still isolated, still remote, still waiting. The Highway of Tears forces us to confront something deeply uncomfortable about the country we think we know. That in Canada, in the modern era, women could vanish from a public road for 5 decades, and the world would look away. But silence is not unique to Highway 16. In Canadian small towns, silence has a way of settling over dark events and staying there for generations.